recording now. Great. Okay, so now it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's or this afternoon's speaker, Ricardo Miller. He works at the National Environment and Planning Agency, where he's the coordinator for fauna. He's therefore tasked with a really important job coordinating efforts to conserve and manage Jamaica's terrestrial fauna species of concern. These include protected, endangered and endemic species. Ricardo has a BSc in zoology from the University of West Indies and an MSc in marine and terrestrial ecosystems. He's also currently studying and hopes to complete soon an MSc in conservation and management of species in trade from the University of Andalusia in Spain. He's an executive member and past president of BirdLife Jamaica, where he's actively involved in the planning of field trips and bird education. And finally, he's the owner and operator of Arrowhead Birding Tours, providing guided field trips across the island to see Jamaica's amazing bird life. He has a wealth of knowledge about the birds of Jamaica, and we're really delighted that he's going to share this with us today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and hand you over into the capable hands of Ricardo. So over to you. Hopefully you
okay,
should.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria.
Welcome.
I am about to share my screen right now. And okay. All right. Thank you very much. It is indeed a pleasure to be here. You know, when I was first asked to do this presentation, I thought about it for a while, and I immediately jumped at it. But it was a little different from what I'm used to. I'm more used to something a little bit more technical, probably dealing with some of the research that I'm doing at my agency at the at NEPA. But this presentation that I'll do this afternoon is going to be fairly basic. It's really an introduction to the birds of Jamaica. So the topic this evening is Jamaica as a hotspot for endemic birds and overwintering migrants. Okay, so the big question we have to ask before we even begin is, what is a biodiversity hotspot? You know, long ago when I just started studying birds, and I came across the concept of a biodiversity hotspot, I thought it meant, you know, it's just an area where there's a lot of birds or you know, high diversity, and that was it. But it's actually a little bit more technical than that. A biodiversity hotspot refers to Earth's most biologically rich areas, yes, but these areas are also threatened. And it actually limits, the term itself actually is being limited to terrestrial regions. So we're not talking about the oceans and the coral reefs and so forth. We're talking about terrestrial areas that are very rich in biodiversity, yet they are threatened. And that last part is actually very, you know, is a key component. So in order to be a biodiversity hotspot, the area has to contain at least 1,500 species of endemic plants. And they single out plants because plants is really the driving force behind most other biodiversity. You know, it creates the various habitats that the various animals will be in. So when they look at just the plants, don't think it's being narrow-minded. It's actually very, very clever, because this way you can incorporate all the animals within. And the key part of this concept, of a hotspot concept, is that that area has to have incurred at least 70% loss in its primary native vegetation. So that's the downside to being classified as a biodiversity hotspot. Now, there are 36 biodiversity hotspots across the world. And, you know, we're focusing on Jamaica, so I'm just going to go through this quickly. This is a map showing all the biodiversity hotspots, all 36 of them across the world. And you'll notice that even the Amazon basin is not considered a biodiversity hotspot. It has a high diversity, yes, but it has not incurred that 70% loss in its native vegetation. And so it is not considered a biodiversity hotspot. The Caribbean, my transitions are moving a little slow. The Caribbean region is a biodiversity hotspot. And by being a biodiversity hotspot, it means that the entire region is actually threatened. Now, in order to qualify, we needed to have at least 1,500 endemic vascular plants to the region. Well, in the Caribbean, there is almost 8,000 endemic vascular plants within the Caribbean region. Now, if we take a look at Jamaica, zoom into Jamaica itself, you can see, the green areas, which are actually representing some of the remaining primary forests that we have. And the pink areas are actually areas that are under threat, are constantly being cut down or modified. Now, as of the year 2000, approximately 70% of Jamaica has tree cover, and that is really good. So when visitors come here, one of the first things that strikes them is how green the country is. But don't be fooled. Having 70% tree cover doesn't necessarily mean it is really high quality. Of that 70%, only 8% is really primary forest. So we actually have lost so much of our primary forest that we qualify to be in a hotspot. And again, that is a negative downside of being a biodiversity hotspot. Now let's get into Jamaican biodiversity. Let me start a little broad before I get onto the topic. Jamaica is very diverse. It has a very diverse habitat. It has over 137 butterfly species have been described in Jamaica. We have 7 anoles, those are lizards. We have 8 different species of snails. We have over 500 species of land snails, and approximately 90% of those are endemic to Jamaica. We have 21 species of bats. We have 21 species of frogs. And if I was to go back a little, let me go back, sorry. Okay, so just to show some of the species that are there, that butterfly in the top left corner, that's the giant swallowtail butterfly. Actually, the official name is a Homerus swallowtail. It's the largest butterfly in the Western Hemisphere, and it is actually endemic to Jamaica. The second picture of that lizard is actually one of our endemic anoles. The Jamaican boa, the largest snake we have on the island, gets up to about 2 meters long. The critically endangered Jamaican iguana, and of course, the last one is a Jamaican hootia, the only remaining land mammal, native land mammal we have. The other mammals are represented mainly by bats. Now, in order to understand how Jamaica came about to have this amount of biodiversity, I'm going to step back in time a little bit. Actually, I'm going to step back a lot, because we're going to go back a few million years and look at the origin of Jamaica. And the driving theory at the moment is that Jamaica at some point had a 3-island origin. We went through periods of submergence where we built up a lot of limestone, and then there was upliftment. But at one point, there were at least 3 islands that eventually uplifted and became the Jamaica we know it as today. Now, over on the western side, we call that the Hanover Block, and that was separated by the Montpelier Newmarket Belt. And I'll go through this quickly. In the middle, we have the Clarendon Block in the center of the island, that large area. So that would have been like an island some 25 million years ago or so. And that was separated by the Wogwater Belt. And then over in the east, we have the Blue Mountain Block. Now, looking at Jamaica's place in the region, you will notice that we are very central in the Caribbean. And understanding our biodiversity and our birds in particular, we have to understand where they came from. And the driving theory at the moment is that majority of our birds actually came from Central America. And they came along what was known as the Nicaraguan rise. So this area, this pale area that is now submerged, was actually uplifted many years ago, well, millions of years ago. And it wasn't joined to Jamaica at any point, but it created a series of islands, which was called the Mid-Caribbean Archipelago. And it is those series of islands that a lot of these animals were able to island hop over to what is now present-day Jamaica. It was easier for some of the birds to cross over along this archipelago. And so we had that general movement from Central America towards Jamaica. And I just want to emphasize that Jamaica at no point, as far as we know, was connected to the mainland. Now, to look at the birds of Jamaica, now we're getting into the meat of the matter. We have 69 resident breeding land bird species on the island. And, we have 29 of those that are endemic. And if you do the math, will drop you somewhere in the mid 40% region, So we have a really high endemism of breeding land birds in Jamaica. We've excluded the water birds for now because those birds are, sometimes they're transient, they're very secretive and so forth. So we have 29 endemic species. And unfortunately, we actually lost 2 species, which would have made it 31. And that's the Jamaican petrel and the Jamaican four-wheel or Jamaican paraki. Now, the 4 bird species that are illustrated here are actually endemic genuses of birds. So we have the first bird there is an orange quit, and it is actually an endemic genus on a whole. We have the yellow-shouldered grass quit, the second one. The third one is actually the red-billed streamer-tail female. And the last one is the Jamaican blackbird. So all 4 species there are actually representing an endemic genus. Now I'm going to, doing a presentation like this is really, putting a lot of pictures so you can actually see what's going on. 29 endemics. I'm going to quickly go through all of them for you. We have the Jamaican peewee. In the top left, we have the Jamaica woodpecker. We have the ringtail pigeon, the arrowhead warbler, the mountain witch. The bottom bird down here, the local name is mountain witch, and I love to use that word. I just think it's a really cool name, especially when you're in the habitat and you hear this bird calling. It does have that haunting sound. But the official name is the crested quail dove. And probably my favorite endemic bird is the one in the top right corner, the Jamaican spindalis. I just think this bird is probably the most photogenic bird we have on the island. Not just because it looks really, really handsome, but it's not very shy. It will come really close for you to get some good photographs. And we have the Jamaican owl. Now, this group are the cetaceans, the parrots and parakeets. We have 2 endemic parrots on the island, the yellow-billed parrot on the right and the black-billed parrot. Now, the third one is the parakeet. And going back to the idea that Jamaican birds mainly came from that Nicaraguan rise and that mid-Caribbean archipelago, this particular species, the olive-throated parakeet, is only known from Central America and Jamaica. And it was suspected for a very long time that the population in Jamaica was different from the population in Central America. And in the mid-2000s, a study was done, and they looked at morphometrics, they looked at genetics, and they came to the conclusion that they should be considered 2 separate species. And so this was accepted by the Handbook of Bird of the World, that checklist, the British system, as I like to call it. It has not yet been accepted by the Clemens classification, the North American classification. But what we're recognizing it as now is the Jamaican parakeet, and the ones in Central America are now called the Aztec parakeet. So this is our newest endemic. I think it was accepted in 2014, if my memory serves me right. So it's a new endemic for Jamaica, and we are quite happy about it. Moving along with our endemics, I'm not even counting how many we've gone, but here are 8 more. I mean, I don't have to call out all the names. We have 2 vireos in the top center, the Blue Mountain vireo and the Jamaican vireo. And the name Blue Mountain vireo might be a little misleading. People might think it's in the Blue Mountains. I actually had a birder with me once who was surprised because she thought the bird was blue, not realize it was named after the mountains, the Blue Mountains of Jamaica. The top left, we have the white-chinned thrush, and everyone's favorite bird, as I like to call it, in the bottom left, the Jamaican toady. And the toady is a species of bird, or a genus rather, that's actually endemic to the Caribbean region. There are only 5 toadies in the world. There's 1 species in Jamaica, 1 in Cuba, 1 in Puerto Rico. And I like to say that Hispaniola cheated, and they have 2 endemic toadies. They have one called the broad-billed toady and the narrow-billed toady. So those are the 5 toadies. And another controversial species is this one, the black-billed streamer tail. It looks like the red-billed streamer tail, but the only exception is that it has a full black bill. And it has always been considered a separate species by the British system, but the American system has always had it lumped just as streamer tail, both the black bill and the red bill, to lumped only as streamer tail. And I've been with researchers who, in particular, Professor Gary Graves, who did a lot of study on these 2 species, especially noting the fact that they are exclusive. They occupy different sections of the island. The black-billed streamer tail is only in the very eastern end of the island, while the red-billed streamer tail is everywhere else. And right where they meet, there is a narrow hybrid zone. And that is quite unique among, the birding world, in having such a narrow hybrid zone across 2 species. So it is still, a little debatable as to whether it is actually 2 species or 1. One interesting fact to note, however, is what I mentioned earlier about Jamaica being formed, having this 3-island origin. And the streamer tail seem to have been separated at some point, whereas the black-billed streamer tail occupied the Blue Mountain block on the eastern end, separated by that warm water belt that I mentioned earlier. And so we've noticed that this separation not only occurred with, the streamer tails, but it occurred with other species, such as other animal species, such as lizards, such as with butterflies. So there was some significant barrier causing these 2 groups of animals, whether it be the birds or reptiles or butterflies, to start to diverge in terms of their genetics, to the point where in some cases they are definitely different species, and in some cases they're probably early in their evolution to be considered 2 species. The last 2 species on the right are the cuckoos, the Jamaican lizard cuckoo at the top. Friend of mine, Sam Woods, who does birding tours, took that lovely picture of a Jamaican lizard cuckoo with a lizard in its mouth. And below that, we have the chestnut-bellied cuckoo, which is the largest endemic bird on the island. This bird gets up to 18 inches long. It's quite massive and quite impressive when you see that bird in flight or just running along the branches in the forest. Let me just round off the rest of the endemics. We have the Jamaican becard in the top left, the Jamaican euphonia, and unlike some of the Central American or South American cousins, this euphonia is fairly muted in color. It doesn't have those bright, flashy yellows and blues, but it's rather muted, but it's still a very, very attractive bird. Another favorite of mine is the bird at the bottom center, which is the white-eyed thrush, or the local name, as we like to call it, the glass eye. And, I always find that local names are sometimes so much better than the taxonomic name that the bird is given. I mean, when you look at this bird, glass eye just clicks, right? We have the Jamaican crow in the middle. Local name is jabbering crow. The woodpecker with Jamaican mango, and over in the bottom left corner here, we have the Jamaican Elenia. And this I would like to share with you is an initiative by BirdLife Jamaica to sensitize the public. It's a public education initiative, and we've redesigned our endemic birds poster of Jamaica. We actually had a poster many years ago, and it was a really good hit. We managed to get it into many schools across the island, and so we identified some funds, and we redesigned and reprinted these posters, and we've started distribution in schools. We've started selling to people across the island. So we're really excited about this. COVID has put some damper on our efforts, but things are looking up. COVID restrictions are being lessened, and so we are optimistic that things will return to normal fairly soon. Now, the endemics is just one part of this talk. The other part is the migrant birds. I mentioned that there are 69 resident breeding land birds. 29 of them are endemic to Jamaica. But when you look at the list of birds for Jamaica, for example, if you go on eBird and say, what's the running list for Jamaica, you get something like 260 bird species have been identified in Jamaica. And you realize that is a far stretch from 69 or even 100 if you include the wetland birds. And it means that we do have a lot of migrants occurring on the island. And most people should recognize this bird. This is the black-throated blue warbler, and it's almost like one of the flagship birds, migrant birds for Jamaica. It is very common during the winter months. So you will recall Jamaica is right here, just below Cuba, right here. And this is a very simplified look at the migratory bird flyways across North America. And Jamaica really benefits from the first two, the Atlantic flyway and the Mississippi flyway. So most of our migrant birds are from the eastern side of North America. They're coming as far as Canada, way up in the tundra. Some of those shorebirds nest fairly far up, and we get quite a lot of migrant warblers. Now, the neotropical North American migrants overwinter between October and April each year. I mean, it can be as early as, mid to late September, you're starting to see some of these migrants. And even early May, you still have a few migrants still, like warblers, for example, still, just feeding, trying to put on some fat for that journey back north. Over 150 species overwinter or migrate through Jamaica annually. And approximately 70 of these species are regular migrants, while the remainders may be considered vagrants. So we, including the land birds, the wetland birds as well, we have about 70 species that are very regular migrants to the island, and others that we occasionally see. A good one I can recall is the American flamingo. For a long time, I've heard that there are flamingos in Jamaica, and it took me a very long time before I actually saw one, because they're vagrants. They show up every 5 or so years. And some years ago, we actually had a small group on the southern side of Jamaica that stayed, they showed up every year for about 5 years in a row. And if you look at the migrant warblers, these I would consider our top 5 migrants. In October, November, December, these birds are everywhere. They're in every garden, they're in basically every habitat type where there is tall enough trees. Now, I mentioned the winter migrants, but there are also summer migrants to the island. We have, and these 4 are the main migrants: the gray kingbird, and that species is or how should I put it? It's strange, because they are actually year-round residents over in Hispaniola in the Dominican Republic. Some of them are year-round residents, and the Hispaniola is just over 100 kilometers to the east of Jamaica. And so you're wondering, why is it they're there and they're not here all year round? But during the months of March, starting March, late March, April, we started to get these migrants coming in, and they come in to breed. Where do they come from? They come from South America. So they move up from South America, they're escaping the winter that's about to begin down in South America, and they move north to exploit the feeding resources. And the fact that all the North American migrants are now moving further north, back into Canada and USA, these birds are moving up from the south to take their place. And on the island, they will breed throughout the summer, and then by September, they start to head back down south. And I'll just name these 4 species for you. This is the least tern. You find them nesting in summer on like salt flats in wetland areas, even on sewage ponds, the gray kingbird, as I mentioned in the top right corner, the Antillean nighthawk. I actually heard my first one 2 days ago, the first one for the season. We call it "Gimme Me Bit." It makes this very specific sound in the evenings. You hear it says that, that sound, "Gimme Me Bit." And then probably the most abundant summer migrant, this one in the lower right corner, John Chewit. That's the local name for it. And that's what I grew up knowing, John Chewit, because that's what it says. It says John Chewit. But this bird, the official name is a black-whiskered vireo. And these four are the main summer migrants to the island. And if you think of it that, there are 50 or so winter migrants that left and head further north and are only replaced by 4 summer migrants, you're starting to realize that these 4 are actually fairly large in numbers. The black-whiskered vireo is everywhere. The gray kingbird is everywhere. So where they lack in number of species for the summer migrants, it makes up in volume. Now, in order to understand, and my presentation is coming to an end, we have to understand that in order to have this large diversity of neotropical migrants coming down, this is driven mainly by the fact that we have a large diversity of habitats across the island. Jamaica, the Blue Mountain Range in the eastern side of the island is the tallest mountain range on the island, and it goes up to 7,402 feet. That's 2,256 meters, I believe. And that's fairly high for such a small island. We have large wetlands on the south coast, on the south and west coast of the island, particularly Black River morass, both upper and lower morass, which I may add was just declared a protected area. And so we're really happy about that. And these here are some more examples of the habitat diversity that we have across the island. Hellshire Hills, the top left corner here, this looks like a partial desert. If you look at it, there's cactus growing, and it's dominated by short shrubs. And this area gets the least amount of rainfall in the island because it's actually in the rain shadow of the Blue Mountain Range. So once the winds, the northeast trade winds come in, all the rain is dumped in the John Crow Mountains and the Blue Mountains, and very little makes it over to Kingston, and barely nothing is left for areas like Hellshire Hills. And so it creates this rather unique landscape. And in fact, there are actually one species of bird. It's not endemic to Jamaica, but it's restricted to this area, and that's the Bahama mockingbird. The Bahama mockingbird is only found in Hellshire Hills and the nearby Portland Ridge, and they share that same sort of desert-like habitat. In the lower left area here is a typical example of your wet rainforest type setting, and this is on probably the most famous birding road on the island, Ecclesdown Road in eastern Jamaica, the foothills of the John Crow Mountains. And this is an overview, an aerial view of some wetlands on the south coast. And I mentioned the protected area system because that is something that is very important if we're looking at maintaining this rich diversity, this large numbers of migrating birds that we have. And being a hotspot, you may recall, means that your habitat is threatened. And this is where the protected area system comes in most. The yellow portion on the right, on the eastern end of the island, is the Blue and John Crow Mountains National Park. And that is a protected area. It's a forest reserve for the most part, so no tree cutting is allowed in that area. And it was recently declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So that's something we're really proud of. This large pink area down the south is a Portland Bight protected area, and it's a really large portion of the island. It includes Hellshire Hills, which is this green portion here, and Portland Ridge down here. But the management of this protected area is a little different than in the park. There's not that many forest reserves, for example. And so the activities, there are quite a lot of activities that are allowed, but there is some amount of control as to what can be done. I mentioned the large morass in the western area. This is the Black River morass. And on the very western end of the island is the Negril Great Morass. And finally, in the middle of the island is probably our best remaining forest, which is the cockpit country. This thick green area in the middle of the island is the cockpit country. And in recent times, there has been a lot of hard work and advocacy work that was being done by regular citizens, by community groups, in trying to protect this area from bauxite mining. And we actually have been successful in that the government declared the area a protected area. It wasn't the really big boundary that we wanted, but it was a step in the right direction. And so the cockpit country is now a protected area. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I am concluding my presentation. And I'll just leave you with this last picture. Since our topic is, biodiversity and hotspot, I'm not sure how many people will recognize this bird, but this is a Kirtland's warbler, an extremely rare bird, extremely rare bird. There's a lot of conservation work that's been done on the breeding grounds in North America around the Michigan State area. And most of this population, if not all, is overwintering in the Bahamas. But in February 2019, this individual showed up in Jamaica, and of all places, it showed up at a banding station in Jamaica. And so the bander, Alicia Brunner, she managed to flush this bird into a net, and she was able to capture it because she just couldn't believe her eyes. And that goes to show that, the conservation work is probably paying off in that the bird population is getting larger and they're looking out to different areas, they're exploring areas, or it could simply be lost, But whatever the case, it also shows that the diversity of habitat in Jamaica enables us to have this large diversity of overwintering migrants, and even those ones that tend to pass through just a few, every now and then. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. That was really fascinating. I love the survey of the different species, the endemic species, and then you went through and looked at the main migrants as well. I love the way that you kind of drew attention to the local names, and I agree with you. They're often particularly kind of evocative and kind of work really well. It was. I think it must be very hard to choose a kind of favourite bird, because there are just so many, kind of like just the wonderful colours. I mean, obviously the spindalis, there was a couple of mentions in the chat of people who are particularly taken with that. I have to say the Jamaican toady is probably my kind of favourite, as if I had to choose one. But it's really good to see that the impacts of conservation efforts, and that, things are moving forward in a positive direction, given how much obviously has been lost. And as you kind of drew out, that being a biodiversity hotspot is both a good and a not such a good thing, because it recognises the diversity that's there, which is wonderful, but also the kind of extent of the loss. And I'm going to kind of open up to questions, and if people want to put their hands up and ask questions, we can probably take some questions directly. And there are a couple of things in the chat as well. But can I just ask you, you did mention a couple of species a couple of endemic species that have been lost. Is that fairly recent? Are they fairly recent losses, and which species are those?
Okay, so we lost two endemic species of birds. One is a Jamaican petrel, a seagoing bird, only known to nest in Jamaica in the Blue Mountains and possibly John Crow Mountains, and the Jamaican poorwill, or Jamaican paraki. Now, the interesting story about those two species is that they were ground nesters. And in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, we had the bright idea to introduce mongoose onto the island to control rats on the cane fields. And back in those days, I like to say that sugar was king. They did anything to protect their sugar investment, their sugar estates. And so they went to Calcutta in India, and they brought back a few pairs of mongoose, and they released them in the cane fields. And it wasn't long after, a few years after, they actually had a newspaper article where the estate owners were boasting about how successful this introduction of mongoose was, because it not only controlled the rats, it also controlled the snakes. And, you know, Jamaica had, I mentioned, 8 endemic snakes. And we have no venomous snakes, and we actually lost a species of snake as well. And so the extinction of those 2 birds was mostly driven by the introduction of the mongoose, but also cats, feral cats, dogs, and wild pigs. So exotic mammalian predators were the main reason for the extinction of these 2 birds, and the fact that they nested on the ground. And so they basically had no chance.
Yeah, obviously made them very vulnerable. And again, it kind of really draws attention to, you know, the kind of often unforeseen consequences of introducing species from elsewhere. And somebody's anchor, I think, mentioned in the chat that they had a similar problem in Hawaii with a release of mongoose, and had a, you know, really quite negative impact.
4 years, yeah. Same amount of, I think it was the same time in the 1800s with the sugarcane plantations.
Well, the full story is that, from what I understand, is that Hawaii, authorities in Hawaii saw the newspaper article about Jamaican farmers boasting about the success they had, and they sent to Jamaica for mongoose. So the original batch of mongoose in Hawaii came from Jamaica, not India. And so...
so it's your fault. It's your fault. Got it.
Okay, so we're going to open it up to questions from the chat, and from, you know, people want to raise their hands and ask in person, you're most welcome. Liz, you've had your hand up for a bit, so if we go to you first, and then I'll go to Marty after that.
I'm afraid it's not Liz, it's Kennedy.
Okay.
The husband, so to speak, although I think it's an egalitarian exercise. Ricardo, thanks very much indeed. Sitting here on the North Coast as we are, would you like to say something a little bit more about the dry forest issues and how important places like Long Mountain at the back of Kingston Harbour and beside Kingston as the capital is to bird conservation?
Okay,
it's
so
difficult.
Yeah, it's not an easy question. So what Liz and Andrew are referring to is the dry habitats that are mainly on the south coast of Jamaica. There are some areas that are close to Kingston, for example, Long Mountain region that you mentioned, and that is semi-dry. It's not as dry as Hellshire Hills or the Portland Ridge, but it came to the forefront in the fact that these areas are under a lot of pressure for housing developments. And again, that is why we are a biodiversity hotspot, because the habitats are under threat. We have the diversity in species, but the habitats are under threat. And it is easy for persons to view dry habitats, semi-dry habitats, as being not a climax forest community. It's almost as if we think a tropical rainforest is the thing. You know, that is what we need to protect. So there's less appreciation for dry forests, because you don't really want to go into a dry forest. It's hot, it's miserable, they can be buggy, and you don't see much most of the time, because unless you get there, you know, at crack of dawn, most of the wildlife already came out and, you know, feed, and they're gone hiding from the early morning sun, the mid-morning sun. And so there is this misconception that there is little value in these dry habitats. And so when we go into these areas, we lose so much diversity, not just in the bird species, but in the habitat itself, because I believe the dry habitats are actually much more threatened than our wet forest. And a lot of these dry habitats are coastal, and these are always under threat for development, for housing, because everybody wants a beachfront property, or a hotel wants to be on the beachfront and so forth. In terms of Long Mountain, for example, people want to be on the hill overlooking Kingston. And so that is the problem we have. Now, we've managed through advocacy and through the efforts of a lot of concerned citizens to be able to hold back the tide in some cases. But to be honest, I'm still not sure what's going to happen. There's a lot of development work happening in Hellshire Hills, close to Hellshire Hills, and are planned for Hellshire Hills. And so it's a little worrying as far as I can see. But you know, I think we can manage and get through at some point.
So thank you for that. And Marty, you had your hand up a little while ago, but you've lowered it now. Did you have a question you wanted to ask?
I just was curious. He had said something about the hurricane in the Bahamas and how the bird came over. And I'm just wondering, do they leave? Like, what happens when there's hurricanes in these islands? Do they flee to each other's islands? Or what can you tell us about how hurricanes impact their migratory behaviors?
Okay. In terms of hurricane impacts both the residents, because there are birds that live there year round. And in order to be there for millennia, thousands of years, you have to be adapted for hurricanes and storms, because we get them, right? And over a few thousand years, we've gone through probably a few thousand hurricanes. So the first thing to understand is that a lot of these birds will make it through, right? A lot of them will make it through by simply riding out the storm in the areas they are. For resident birds, we don't really get them moving over to other islands unless it's inadvertently by the wind, they may be carried over. But for the migrant birds, they are very keen in understanding the environment. They actually, most of the times, know ahead that there's a storm ahead, and they start to change course. And that is when, for us as bird watchers, for example, we get really excited when we hear a storm is at sea at the start of the migration period, because it might result in a fallout. Birds that don't normally stop on the island might just decide, it's better to rest, let the storm pass, and then continue on their journey. So there are two types of adaptation. There's one, the residents that, a lot of them are really hardy. Don't get me wrong, a lot of them do die, but the population, the species as a whole will persist. And of course, the migrants, they do adjust their behavior when they sense that there's storm at sea.
Thank you. And I'm going to go to Kieran and just see if there's a couple of questions that you want to pick up from the chat.
Well, we've had a couple that were answered in the chat, so I'll focus on the ones that haven't. Gahan's asked which ones would you rate as the top 5 birding lodges in Jamaica, taking into account the amount of forest they have around them and the wildlife. So if people are visiting Jamaica, Ricardo, where would you recommend they stay to see the best that Jamaica has to offer bird-wise?
Oh, that's a hard question. Because I have some areas that are just really nice. I'm not sure if Wendy Lee is logged on, but she introduced me to an area in the cockpit country called Stewart Town. And that's one of the areas that is being threatened by bauxite mining. And the cockpit country itself can be a very hard area to bird, but that Stewart Town road is gold. I can get lots of endemics in a single day, but there's not much of a lodge there nearby. There might be some down in Runaway Bay, but nothing established in terms of birding. You'll be some distance away. But for me, if you want to be in a spot where there are good birds, you can't beat being in the Blue Mountains. I have a soft spot for a place called Starlight Chalet in the Blue Mountains. It's a little rustic. They have their little issues, but there's nothing beating waking up in the morning with a hot cup of coffee and a rufous tail flycatcher 4 feet away. And I'm actually describing a week ago, right? Waking up with a coffee in my hand and a rufous tail flycatcher and a standard flycatcher came down on the railing 4 or 5 feet away, catching those insects that were by the light in the night. You just can't beat that. That area of the Blue Mountains is right around Hardware Gap area. It's actually Silver Hill Gap, but Hardware Gap is just around the corner. And it doesn't have the most species. It doesn't have the most endemic species. There are no parrots up there, for example. There are parakeets, but no parrots. There are no crows. But what I like to say is that the hard species, the really hard species, are there in good numbers. Your crested quail dove, really hard. You get them easily in the mountains. The Jamaican blackbird, the Blue Mountain vireo, some of those are really much easier in the Blue Mountains than in other places. So while some places may rack up a large species list, it might take a while to achieve that. Whereas in the Blue Mountains, the hard species are there. Starlight Chalet is my pick.
Thanks, Ricardo. I'll just ask one more quickly as well, Maria. We've had a question from Kim, Ricardo, that she's asked, we'll just so that we can fit all the questions in, we'll limit it to one tip. So what would be your top tip for somebody starting birding?
Sorry, I didn't get, can you say that question one more time? My top 10 what?
No, your absolute top tip for somebody new to identifying birds, what would it be?
Oh, the top 10 birds I would show someone who's new to birds?
Sorry. She's asking what your top advice would be, your top tip for somebody new to identifying birds.
Someone, okay, I get you, I understand now. Top 10, that's a lot. The first thing I would say is be patient. The first advice is be patient. The next advice I would give is learn your binoculars, learn your equipment, practice how to use that equipment. Just practice, it doesn't have to be at a bird, looking at an object and getting your binoculars on it and quickly focusing. Just keep practicing that. So those are probably the first two things, and those go hand in hand. Learn your equipment, because that is very important for you to learn to identify the species, to even find the species in your binoculars in the first place. The next thing I would say is start easy, start simple, start with your yard. Start with the birds that come to your yard, and you just keep at it until you understand what's happening in your yard, to the point where you can identify that there's something new that you haven't seen. And that is important, because when you're out and developing your birding skills, you don't want to be so easily distracted by a common bird. You look at it once and you look at it twice. You don't want to constantly be pulled, your attention being pulled by a common bird, where you could be focusing on trying to see something new or something exciting. But I'll just leave it at those three for now, because it can go, it can get very interesting.
Thanks. That's a really good. I think that's really kind of helpful things to start off with, and particularly getting to to really know how to use your binoculars. I think that's something that perhaps people don't jump into kind of looking at things, but actually really understand your equipment is really helpful. I'm going to go now to a couple of people with their hands up. You've been waiting very patiently. Thank you. So Bob, you were first. Would you like to ask your question now?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for a great talk about Jamaican birds. And I've just been to Jamaica, and I stayed in a hotel on the north coast, and it was a family holiday. But I was very anxious to get out there and have a look at some of the birds, which I did. I mean, Wendy Lee took me to Stewart Town Road, which was great. I mean, we spent a few hours there and saw some great birds. But and Rocklands was quite good, because we went there as well, and you could sit there and the hummingbirds would come to you, which was absolutely fabulous. My daughter loved that. But the thing I wanted to ask was, what disappointed me slightly. The Jamaican wildlife is wonderful, but in the tourist hotels, there was no attempt to have bird feeders or anything like that to sort of introduce the ordinary holiday maker to the fantastic wildlife in Jamaica. And the only attempt really was Rocklands. And I just wondered how the Jamaicans could sort of do more to try and get the hotels to take on board the fact that you have got this wildlife, and we should be promoting it because it's precious. And is there anything, have you got any ideas how we could do that? Just get tourism is a huge resource for Jamaica, and we need to introduce the tourists to the wildlife. How can we do that? Have you any ideas?
Okay, so some of what you're saying is actually being done as we speak.
Right, good.
But there are different types of tourism, and when you speak of those large all-inclusive hotels, we can call lots of names, those 2,000 rooms hotels. I'm going to put my hand up in the air and say it's going to be really difficult, almost impossible, to get them to look at something else that won't give them any further revenue, because their main aim is to have, volume of people and, shepherd them through. But where it's actually working is those smaller boutique hotels. So when you move a little bit away from Montego Bay, Negril, Ocho Rios, well, and start getting towards the east in Ocho Rios, Port Antonio, you're starting to see a shift in the tourism lifestyle and the tourism offer. And you're actually starting to see some of those things you're mentioning. You're starting to see bird feeders up and about. I can think of a nice place, Hermosa Cove. It's quite pricey in Ocho Rios, where a friend of mine, someone who I took birding, gotten so familiar with the staff that he, they dedicated a little garden, a hummingbird garden in his honor, and he brought down feeders, and they've been doing it for several years. And the staff there are, they're telling people about the birds and so forth. So it's happening, but I don't think it will happen at those large hotels. It's a smaller boutique hotels, and I hope I'm answering your question a bit. I feel like I'm dodging it, but it's happening. But more can be done. But don't think too hard on those large hotels at all.
I think that's just built tourism, and most people don't care. But it is a wonderful place. So thank you very much.
Thanks.